Hello Chipmunk and Chipette fans, and before I begin, I want to remind you all, please, watch the entire video before you comment. I know topics surrounding the Fox, Alvin and the Chipmunks movies tend to get a lot of you reactive, so I just want to make sure everyone understands so that I don't get rant comments about things with obvious answers. Anyway, welcome back to another installment of Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations. My name is Grandy Tamias, the speculative evolved species of upright walking chipmunk, and today's topic will be, what would have happened if the 20th Century Fox Alvin and the Chipmunks films had continued? First, I want to make something absolutely crystal clear. By continuation of the Fox Chipmunk films, I do not specifically mean an Alvin and the Chipmunks 5, even though I will talk a lot about that later. In previous videos, I mentioned the possibility of a spin-off film about the Chipettes, or a prequel about the chipmunks living in the forest, which is still considered a continuation regardless of what time said hypothetical films are set. Although both are more wishful thinking than anything, and should not be considered a possibility as of yet. And speaking of wishful thinking, that's all I seem to be receiving in the comments whenever I say anything about Alvin and the Chipmunks movies. Proposing such ideas does not progress our understanding of the topic in question. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, you're just letting your imaginations harmlessly run wild. No, what's wrong here is expecting the answer to this question to change the future. We're not here to start some big movement to continue the Chipmunk film series. If you want to do that, go ahead, just not in my comment section. When I propose the questions that I make Alvin and the Chipmunks videos about, what I'm really trying to do is explain a certain phenomenon by taking a realistic approach and taking into account the intentions of the people involved in creating these movies. In other words, asking about the alternate world where the Fox films somehow continued is not as simple as spouting out a whole bunch of unsubstantiated nonsense about Alvin and the Chipmunks 5, but rather looking at the information behind the scenes, using other examples, looking at trends these films have had, and overall jumping through as few hoops and assumptions as possible. You know the old saying that the most logical answer is the one with the fewest assumptions. Yeah, that's what we're doing here. So let's start off by questioning when the best time would have been for another film to come out. That time has since passed, but I feel like it's important to address anyway due to how 20th Century Fox as a company changed in the years after Road Chip. The first trilogy of Chipmunk films began in 2007 and ended in 2011, with each film 2 years apart and released about a week before Christmas. Then we had a 4-year gap from the third film to the fourth film, which was again released right before Christmas. I don't know if there was some sort of contract when they were planning the first 3 films when they started making the 2007 one, or if they only decided to make each sequel after the previous one had already come out. I mean, these films relatively don't take too long to make compared to the higher budget 2-hour plus action movies we're used to now, which are often planned 3 or 4 years in advance, though a significant amount of that is pre-production and filming takes place over a year or more before the release. For a Chipmunk film, shooting probably only lasted 2 or 3 months. In fact, I think a bulk of the time goes to rendering the VFX for the Chipmunks themselves. Then the trailer comes out, usually 6 months ahead of the film's release, and the remaining time up to then is just touch-ups to the effects and editing, deciding which scenes they want to keep in or cut, and that's about it. So I think 2 years is ample time to make a Chipmunk film starting from the release of the preceding film. In which case, I don't know why there was a 4-year gap until Road Chip. Maybe Fox just decided to give it a rest so as not to make the film series fatigued, because after Chipwreck pulled in less money than the sequel, I think releasing another one too soon would have made audiences really tired. But who am I kidding? My channel seems to attract a lot of you who would have begged your parents to take you anyway, and if they had released a Chipmunk film back in 2013 or 2014, I probably would have joined the fanbase a lot sooner. But as for what we got with Road Chip, I think Fox was testing the waters with that film to see if the 4-year gap had paid off, and audiences would have been ready for another trilogy of Alvin and the Chipmunks films. But since it performed worse than Shipwrecked and had gone up against Star Wars The Force Awakens, I'm guessing they decided making another film, whether it be a sequel, spin-off, or otherwise, would have been a bad idea. If they had released another one in 2017, it would have gone up against another Star Wars film. Actually, a spin-off in the Chipmunk film universe probably could have deviated from the normal release schedule of the main films, kind of like what Star Wars was doing, but if they wanted to release, hypothetically, a Chipette spin-off film in 2016, 1 year after Road Chip, they would have had to have planned that well before Road Chip released. but Star Wars had their own spin-off that year, Rogue One, so Alvin and the Chipmunks would have kept getting crushed by Star Wars. Regardless of that, let's just pretend for a moment that the Star Wars and box office and critical response didn't matter. There probably would have been only one more film after Road Trip, and then things would have completely stopped around 2017, because that's when talks started for Disney to buy out Fox. And sure, that acquisition wasn't finalized until early 2019, but let's face it, that was inevitable whether they had made more Chipmunk films or not. It's not like Alvin and the Chipmunks was going to be the big movie franchise successful enough to make Fox want to say, nope, we don't need to sell ourselves to Disney. And if you've been following my videos for a while now, you know that Disney cannot make an Alvin and the Chipmunks film due to the fact that while they may have the distribution rights and can apparently put Road Trip on Disney's Square Root without a problem, they do not own the rights to the Alvin and the Chipmunks characters and IP, and would need the cooperation, or at least approval, of the company that does, that being Bagdasarian Productions, who, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times, would never approve of their characters being creatively controlled in a production by the tyrannical media glutton that is Disney. Oh god, I'm gonna get a lot of hate for calling Disney that. I guess media overlord? Still harshly accurate, but less offensive. Okay, now we got the real-world logistical stuff out of the way, but how about from a story perspective? How could they have continued these films? Well, I guess we should use the word continue loosely here, because these films don't really prioritize continuity with each other, as none of them leave any loose ends that demand resolution in a sequel. Nor do you really need to understand what happened in the preceding film to understand the one after it. For example, you could remove Chipwrecked and it would not change anything that's required to understand Road Trip. Sure, there are some bits of connective tissue, like needing to watch the squeakquel if you really want to know who the Chipettes are before Chipwrecked or Road Trip. I guess not that you would need to know them very well for Road Trip anyway, because the Chipettes were barely in it. And, Ian Hawke's persistence throughout the first 3 films. In fact, focusing on that latter example, sure, it was nice that they tried to give Ian an arc across that trilogy, but it was kind of disjointed. He remains pretty much the same throughout the squeakquel, so you could just skip from film 1 to film 3 and understand his redemption pretty much the same. Plus, his change in Shipwrecked doesn't really recontextualize anything about the previous entries. Ian honestly could have been dropped from the squeakquel or Shipwrecked or both, and it wouldn't really have changed the atmosphere that defines each of those films. There could have been another villain in his place, as I think he was only kept around because David Cross is a comedian that the parents are more likely to recognize and was a big selling point to justify them paying to keep watching these movies with their kids. And even if you want to say that his character arc and all that does matter, well, that's all the more reason for him not to appear in Alvin and the Chipmunks 5 or any more films. If Road Trip had been the start of a second trilogy, it's clear that they wanted to go in a different direction and probably would have made James Suggs the persistent villain. Ian Hawke probably would not have had anything meaningful to do considering what Road Trip was about, but of course none of that matters anyway without the actor David Cross, who, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but he did not particularly enjoy his experience working on the first 3 Alvin and the Chipmunks films. It doesn't matter how much you enjoy the character, sometimes actors don't even like the work that they do. Cross was only doing it for the money and has gone on record saying that he hasn't even seen Chipwrecked. And why should he? I'm not saying that appreciation of Ian Hawke is unjustified, even if you were among the younger fans at the time, but when it's clear that an artist isn't willing to put much work into the character, it's kind of hard to defend that character's portrayal beyond just the nostalgia fans have for him and the films, which isn't really a defense at all. Speaking of human characters not returning, I've gotten tons of comments saying that Samantha and Miles should return as well, but I just don't think that would be very likely despite Miles' bond with Alvin, Simon, and Theodore in Road Trip. The franchise has for a long time operated on a status quo, meaning everything returns to exactly the same as it was when it started. Hence why I said that Chipwrecked could be removed and it doesn't change anything. So I wouldn't be surprised if they wanted to tell a completely different story, as always, for Alvin and the Chipmunks 5 or whatever movie, and Dave and Samantha are not still dating or married. They probably would have broken up. It happened between the first and second films as well, where despite Dave and Claire last being seen on friendly terms, she's not seen or mentioned in the squeakquel. No explanation is ever given as to what happened to Claire, but it's almost universally assumed that she and Dave broke up, especially since many years later, Dave says that he had been dating Samantha for months prior to the events of Road Trip, and was presumably available long before that. Plus, if you know the source material, Dave has never gotten married. It's just part of his character. They've come really close, like the 80s episode literally called Dave's Getting Married, but him actually getting married would change the status quo. That's why you don't just go against the time-honored tradition of the franchise. Dave must always remain a single dad, and you have to accept that he's never going to tie the knot. Basically, expecting Alvin and the Chipmunks 5 to follow up on Dave and Samantha's relationship would have been like expecting the third film to follow up on Toby's relationship with the Chipmunks' music teacher from the second film. But no, instead we got that whole deserted island plot that no one could have expected just based on what happened at the end of the second film, because why were we supposed to expect it? These films aren't continuations of each other in the truest sense, like I was saying earlier in the video. They're episodic, just like the cartoons they're based on. A proper Alvin and the Chipmunks 5 would have had nothing to do with any relationships formed or lessons learned or adventures from the fourth film or any films prior. You might be saying, but what about the Chipettes? They formed relationships with the Sevilles, even living with them at the end of the Squeakquel, and yet they were in Shipwrecked and Road Trip. Well, that's different. They're legacy characters who existed in the cartoons. Did Zoe exist in the cartoons, with multiple episode appearances to her name? No, so she didn't appear in Road Trip. You could argue that Ian doesn't fit that description either, and yet he appeared in multiple films, but at least he was based on a character who was, at some point, a reoccurring presence in the cartoons. The only exception I could possibly make would be Agent Suggs if he was basically supposed to be the new Ian, but we'll never know because we never got a fifth film for him to be in. And where they left him off, I think is a good place. His return isn't needed, but personally I wouldn't mind if his reintroduction is believable. So there you have it, fanfiction writers. If you want to write a proper Alvin and the Chipmunks 5, or a spin-off or whatever, in the same spirit as the official films, start with a mostly clean slate that has nothing to do with the plots of the other films. Perhaps take a bit of inspiration from the cartoons, like how the 2007 film had part of its plot based on the 80s episode The Chipmunk Story, and if you're feeling really lucky, you can make Suggs the villain again, but that's totally optional. I know this video probably isn't going to sit well with some of you who have been hard beggars for a continuation of the Chipmunk movie universe, but you know what they say, beggars can't be choosers. So on the off chance we ever do get a continuation, don't expect it to actually continue anything. Here I would normally pose a few questions for you to write about in the comments, but I feel like I already know what I'm getting myself into, so I'll just give you all a warning that if I get a barrage of hate posts saying that I've ruined your childhood, I will disable all comments. So please, be considerate of those who actually want to say something nice, because I don't want to have to shut them out too. Anyway, you're welcome to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and doing so will let me know if you want more videos like this. Feel free to leave suggestions for future video topics in the comments or on my Discord server, which will be linked in the description. There you can also interact with me and other Chipmunk fans, as well as get sneak peeks at upcoming videos. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.